Hi, this is the fifth video in my Minecraft lore series, the Minecraft Timeline, and today I'll be covering the events following the ancient builders' evacuation of the Nether and their subsequent downfall. And the question I'll be answering is, what led to their downfall? I've heard two main theories for this topic, one of which being the Wither. The Wither was an attempt at a golem that would protect the Nether structure, maybe the fortress, or maybe some other structure they were planning on making. It was created using 4 soul sand in a T-shaped formation, and 3 skulls from the withering skeletons of the fortress, who would have been charred and burned, if not for the sanctuary of the structure. However, rather than a golem that the builders could bend to their will, they got a monster. The souls from the soul sand collected and unified as one. The withered bones of skeletons that had been buried in the sand, as well as the skulls, were assembled into a 3-headed monstrosity of a skeleton. The withered skulls had a force within them that could draw out these souls, and you can even watch as all the spirits are absorbed by the beast as it emerges from the soul sand. Just like the withered skeletons, the wither can inflict the withering effect, unsurprisingly, making it hard to defeat. It summoned explosive skulls to launch at enemies. It would kill anything at sight, taking revenge on the cruel world that once held the creatures of whom the spirits belonged to, summoning roses after the death of each innocent creature. This may be because, since it's made up of many different spirits, their attitude may be a bit conflicted. Once it was spawned, it caused a huge explosion that would have wiped out any nearby builders. The remaining builders would have had to flee the Nether to avoid it. Although the Wither was extremely destructive, and could have driven the builders back to the overworld, I doubt it was dangerous enough to destroy an entire civilization, or even force them into hiding. If a single builder can handle one all on their own, who's to say that a group of them can't do the same? The builder's total disappearance simply doesn't make sense under this narrative. It would make more sense if the builders were the ones who killed the Wither. In fact, there is even evidence for this. For one, there is chiseled red sandstone that depicts a Wither. As I've mentioned, our player only knows these recipes because their ancestors knew about them. So, we can assume the Wither likely went down as a legend, at least in the areas with red sand. But okay, maybe those were carved during a war against the beast. However, more evidence can be found by looking at the desert temple, which has an odd pyramid shape. Obviously, these were inspired by real-life pyramids, which had that shape because it was structurally optimal. This only makes sense in the context of gravity, though, and sandstone is unaffected by gravity. It also has a weird opening at the top. This specific shape implies one thing only, that the desert temples were built not just to house treasure, but also a fully powered beacon, meaning the ancients would have had to kill the Wither for its nether star, a collection of souls into one powerful item. It may have taken an army, but with diamond and even netherite armor at their disposal, the builders could definitely have defeated the Wither. Okay, but if not the Wither, then how did all the ancient builders die? Well, the thing is, we don't actually know that they died. We just assume that because we don't see them anymore. While I do think they would have died, I also think they would have been able to respawn. Most theorists simply discard the ability to respawn as a necessary component of gameplay. Death isn't a part of the main character's story, and although that is true for most games, I think the ability to respawn is canon in Minecraft. Think about it, in most games with a storyline, after you die, your progress gets reset to your last save. You keep all the items you had before your last save, and everything you did afterward gets undone. In a sense, you don't change the story by dying, you just go back in time to fix your mistake. So in the canon of the game, the main character never actually dies. But in Minecraft, when you die, you lose all your items and have the ability to pick them back up again from where you died. You're looting your own corpse. Nothing you did after you set your respawn point is undone. Your death wasn't erased from the story, it was a part of it. This idea is further reinforced by the trial chambers, which have beds. Why would you need to sleep if you're underground? Unless, of course, you needed to respawn because you died to a trial spawner. How does Steve know how to craft a respawn anchor? Well, it's because his ancestors used them to live in the Nether. Even if we can explain this using the mechanic of the end portal bringing you back to your respawn point, which has its own problems, how do we explain the ancients having echo shards in their chests in the ancient city, if all they're used for is to make a recovery compass that points to your last death? Why would Steve's book even have this recipe? But that raises the question, where did the ancient builders go? If they can't die, then how did they disappear? Well, if they shared our player's ability to come back from the dead, then the ancient builders could have simply been a small group of players. After all, Minecraft is very different from reality. Building something doesn't take a long time at all, so a group of players could have easily built all these structures given enough time. This means that they could have simply just moved away from spawn. But there is another theory that has a bit more evidence than just pure speculation. The other popular hypothesis, other than the Wither, are the undead. The ancient builders could respawn, making them immune to any real threats. However, if the threat was some sort of disease, it could be bad. This is because they wouldn't necessarily need to die in order to turn. So, theoretically, a zombie outbreak or something like it would probably be one of the only ways a civilization could disappear. Plus, it explains why we see all the undead creatures with such similar proportions and outfits, with the outfits thing being unusually uncanny. But it's hard to say what the exact origin of the infection is. One theory is that the Illagers created the first zombie. If you look in their mansion, you find experiments that point towards them trying to recreate life. You also find blue wool that is reminiscent of the signature clothes that zombies wear. But this doesn't line up timeline-wise. In the very beginning of Minecraft Legends, we can see zombies already existing, and the Illagers don't break off from the regular villagers until the end of the game. There are quite a few different theories that players have come up with, which just goes to show how mysterious the origin of the undead really is. There's not a lot to work with, but there have been too many instances in this series where I talk about multiple different ideas and don't have a firm stance on the topic, but not this time. I believe that the virus exists in the air in the Nether. This would imply that the virus is more likely a unique type of fungus or spore than an actual virus, although it remained pretty much dormant until it was exposed to the unique conditions of the overworld, where it reacted with the atmosphere and gained the odd ability to affect the ancients in an indescribable, disturbing way that kind of killed them in a sense. But the virus didn't show itself quite yet, as its incubation period, or the period of time between infection and when the symptoms appear, was rather long, so the builders went about their regular lives. So not only were the ancient builders infected, so were the mobs that they spent the most time with, that being the pigs, horses, and the other mounts, minus the golems since they were artificial. Technically all mobs can be infected, but only the builders and mobs close by them were, since it's actually pretty hard for the virus to infect a mob. The virus also preferred mobs with brains, a classic trope in most zombie-related media. But the undead couldn't detect intelligence that well, so they only targeted the smartest of mobs like villagers and ancient builders. The infection spread fastest during the night, when everybody was asleep and couldn't actively run away or prevent themselves from turning into zombies. In fact, they were pretty much completely safe during the day, since zombies were extremely vulnerable to the heat of the sun due to the poor condition of their skin. So the undead really only appeared at night. And I've mentioned in my third video in this series that if a new type of mob were to appear, then the Flames of Creation could replicate it and summon it in other places that share characteristics with the original environment, hence the zombies being able to spawn wherever it's dark. After the subsequent outbreak, some zombies would eventually have their skin rot away entirely, leaving just the bones behind. This would lead one to conclude that the ancient builders aren't alive due to natural processes, but because of magic. Or more likely, the builders are alive naturally, but the virus infects them with magic, as well as turning them into zombies, leading to the possibility of a living skeleton deprived of any organs, but only after infection. Only when the skeleton is the only thing left are the builders sort of free from the wrath of the virus, as demonstrated by skeletons being able to use long-range weapons and their increased control over their movement. Going back to Minecraft Legends, one thing I found very interesting was how the mobs that we consider hostile, such as zombies and skeletons, were peaceful before the Piglin War, which raises some questions about the actual time of the apocalypse. See, I assume that the apocalypse takes place before the events of Legends, since the outbreak would have already happened, and it would make sense why we see no builders in Legends, just the villagers and us, who are from another timeline or multiverse or just another point in time. I don't really know about that, to be honest. But if the mobs used to be passive, then why would the builders have been in danger? Well, remember when I said the virus probably traveled through the air? Yeah, well I said that because it explains why the builders would have so easily turned into zombies, and how the apocalypse was so dangerous. Minecraft Legends likely took place after the virus kind of calmed down, in a sense, if that's possible. It was still out there, but didn't spread as fast anymore, hence why we don't see villagers, or us for that matter, randomly turning into zombies. But I'm sure you've noticed that in this timeline, I have yet to mention a few structures. The ancients haven't even visited the end yet, which can only mean that not all builders turned into zombies. Some of them fled underground. To us, this might seem a bit odd. The undead aren't a threat to us, but that's just because the builders developed a sort of immunity to the virus. Back then, if the undead posed even the slightest threat, it could be detrimental, since, if you remember, it's their only way they would ever cease to exist. So, the builders fled the surface. Underground, the virus wasn't floating through the air, so they were much safer. Although zombies still spawned wherever it was dark, which was pretty much everywhere when talking about caves. And speaking of spawning zombies, the ancients actually used their previous expertise with the flames of creation to spawn the undead at will. For example, putting them in dungeons to punish other builders. Of course, this was after the mobs turned hostile. There is also reason to believe that the builders went back to the nether to escape the undead, but that only brought skeletons to the dimension and infected some piglins. In trying to create a new golem to protect them in the nether, they inadvertently summoned the wither, and made things even worse. It seemed wherever they went, the virus followed. Other builders, or maybe even other villagers, tried to find a cure to the pandemic. They hid their rather inhumane experiments under the carpets of some igloos. They figured out some interesting things. Number one, potions have a reverse effect on the undead. And number two, giving weakness to a zombie followed by the magical golden apple will revert it back to being a villager. Who did these experiments? Well, I doubt it was just any other villager, or else it would be very inhumane. It could be a builder who did this, who simply isn't going with the rest of them. It would have had to been someone who has traveled the globe, considering the out-of-place cactus that we find. So, another more intriguing idea I've heard is the wandering trader, an outcast who used to be the nitwit of his village, who now travels the globe selling and buying items from other villagers and ancient builders. We know they have knowledge of potions, maybe even more so than clerics, as demonstrated by their invisibility and milk. It seems outlandish to think that they were the ones who developed a cure to the disease, and maybe they didn't. However, you should acknowledge that they buy fermented spider eyes, a core ingredient in weakness potions, and sell cacti. They might have gone to an isolated, cold area to develop a way to bring back villagers, which would have been great for business in a few different ways. I love to keep talking about how the builders migrated underground and the multiple other structures that were built, such as the trial chambers. But structures like those weren't constructed until later, after the Piglin War, when the undead turned hostile, and others deserve their very own video. So for now, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for my next video about the ancient city.